So our last module of the gender chapter, on chapter 5, is module 9. And we're going to look at gender nonconformity, transgender, and then some just persistence of the beliefs of gender differences. So I will say once again that your book tends to be a little bit behind and delayed. I imagine in the next edition it'll be a little bit more information about gender nonconformity, or non-binary, I believe is the term now. Nonconformity sounds a little bit like it's the fault of the person who's not conforming to gender expectations, and we're not going to blame people for their gender identity. And so non-binary is one of the words that have been used, and then you have issues non-cisgender, and all sorts of kind of terms. And the thing is, lack of clarity is mainly due to the fact that this is a relatively new sort of thing that our culture is dealing with, as far as how to term it, what people prefer to go by, even the pronouns that are to be used for individuals who are transgender. You know, do they prefer traditional he or she, or do they prefer a they? There's also a Z that has been mentioned. So this is something that you kind of wrestle with before there is a consensus in our culture on how to term individuals that are transgender or gender non-binary. And so typically what we see is that those who are under the gender nonconformity or non-binary typically identify as either female or male, but their behaviors are more androgynous to a degree that falls outside of conventional norms. Now, once again, though, we know that that's not quite true, because there are a lot of people that do identify neither as male or female. They're kind of solidly in between the two. And so that also kind of creates some issues for individuals on how exactly they prefer to be referred to. And you may have seen, I know I certainly have among faculty, that there are preferred pronouns at the bottom of their signature line to kind of indicate their awareness about this kind of non-binary and transgender kind of issue. And there's also, a lot of kind of information in regards to not only transgender, but like heterosexuality and homosexuality, which is really nothing to do with gender. So sexuality is usually who you're attracted to from a sexual standpoint, and doesn't necessarily on how you self-identify in your gender. So as you might be able to tell, this is a subject that is probably likely to change over the next few years as we get a better idea of that population, and more kind of consensus on how they prefer to be called. But in the meantime, we're kind of muddling through. But it's important to also note that this is a growing realization that we do have a part of the population. Now, I will say the vast majority usually firmly identify consistent with their biological sex. So their biological sex and gender are the same, and that's the majority of the people out there. But for a minority, that is not true, and that is where transgender comes into play. Now, unfortunately, those who identify as transgender in adolescence and emerging adulthood are at more notable risk for verbal and physical aggression and bullying. In many cases, even though there is growing acceptance, it's not universal. And so that's something individuals who are transgender often have to deal with, and makes it that much more difficult. Think of all the things you're going through in adolescence, and then throw in that you don't believe that you're the gender that everybody wants to assign to you. And that creates a lot of issues, and that fact of maybe not fitting in to the degree that others who are more consistent with their biological sex and gender identification might be. So that's a lot to deal with. Gender stereotypes in emerging adulthood that we see. One of the things that is important to note, okay, is that there is more similarity than differences in characteristics between genders, okay? And most human characteristics are going to fall into kind of a normal distribution, okay? And so that means a small proportion of people are going to rate much higher than most other people in particular areas, but most are going to be kind of fall somewhere in the middle, on a lot of these characteristics, or around average. Yet, that being said, we still have the tremendous power of gender schemas and gender stereotypes. And for that, this is where we attribute certain characteristics to others just because they're either male or female. So trucks are for male, shopping is for female. So we're going to automatically assume that maybe an adolescent boy would not want to shop, or that an adolescent girl doesn't like trucks. Okay, and we make these assumptions, and we're making these assumptions consistently, because once formed, these schemas help influence us in how that we ultimately behave. And so this just gets into a little bit more detail of what I was just talking about, okay, which is basically that normal distribution in regards to various traits. And look at this. This is what we're talking about with normal distribution. The difference between males and females, students say, in math. Okay, look at that. There really is a little bit of difference where you have more males at the top end, a few more on the females on the bottom end. But look at how the overlap there, to the point where I would never want to be a betting person trying to say who was more mathematic and likely to succeed. Okay, so even when there are existence of these sorts of things, they overlap so much that it's almost not worth trying to point out that difference. Okay, as I was mentioning earlier about gender schemas, they tend to shape what we notice, how they interpret, how we remember things, and our expectations about genders. And the fact is that we tend to seek out reinforcing information for our pre-existing gendered expectations, and therefore it's harder to overturn when those are inaccurate, because we're only looking at confirming information. A lot of times the social roles that males and females play enhance or suppress different capabilities, what they call social roles theory. So there was a big thing of, oh, women can't be firefighters. And they would say, well, why not? Well, have you ever seen a female firefighter? And people say no. They would say, well, there you go. It's because they can't handle it. Now, that is a flawed logic, because odds are that women weren't given a chance, because and then many of them may not have even believed that women were capable, because that's what they've been told all along, until you had some courageous women come along and prove that yes, they could do it. Same thing for things like male nurses. Men are doctors; they're not going to be nurses, and yet you have, once again, a courageous male goes into that role and proves that they can do it, and therefore it is an incorrect gendered stereotype. But this is the power that we have here. So differential kind of gender socialization is going to lead males and females to develop their different skills and attitudes. And that when that happens, that leads to different behaviors. And those differences in behavior then confirm the beliefs of those individuals and the individuals that are growing up and developing or behind them, because it once again just kind of reinforces that. It isn't an end-all be-all, because otherwise we would be back to some of the descriptions that we did earlier in this chapter of women and their expectations and what they should do. And we know that as time goes by, changes do occur. And so we need to make sure that we make note of that. Okay, so that wraps up Chapter 5 regarding gender. We'll be starting Chapter 6 soon enough. And thanks for making it through all 9 modules. See you for next chapter.